Hello, and welcome to another gentle descent into the past. Tonight, we'll open the doors to a world once lost, now rediscovered through quiet storytelling. Perhaps you're lying still beneath the covers, or letting the last hours of the day melt away. Either way, I'm honored to have you here. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from. Are we continents apart, or just a few time zones away, both listening as the stars come out? If you enjoy resting to soft-spoken tales and thoughtful history, be sure to subscribe. There's so much more to uncover together. Well, 3. The magnificent halls of ancient Egypt. Pharaoh Ramses III ruled over an empire that stretched from Nubia to the Levant. He commanded armies, built temples, and was worshipped as a living god. But behind the golden walls of his palace, a different kind of drama was unfolding. A drama filled with jealous queens, ambitious concubines, and deadly conspiracies that would ultimately shake the very foundations of the Egyptian throne. I'm about to take you inside the most scandalous royal harem in ancient history, where beauty was a weapon, love was a luxury, and betrayal was just another day at the palace. This isn't just another boring history lesson about pharaohs and pyramids. This is the true story of how the women closest to the most powerful man on earth orchestrated one of the most shocking assassination plots in human history. By the end of this journey, you'll discover how a secondary wife's burning ambition led to murder, how palace servants became willing conspirators, and how the greatest pharaoh of his time met his end not on a battlefield, but in his own bedroom. We'll explore the dark corridors of power where queens plotted against each other, where concubines schemed for their children's futures, and where the line between love and hate became dangerously blurred. But before we dive into the blood and betrayal, let me paint you a picture of just how extraordinary this world really was. The royal harem of Ramses III wasn't just a collection of beautiful women. It was a sophisticated political institution that housed hundreds of wives, concubines, children, and servants. It was a city within a city, complete with its own administrators, guards, and even its own economy. Picture this: towering walls of sandstone and granite, decorated with intricate hieroglyphs telling stories of divine love and royal power. Gardens filled with exotic flowers and fruit trees, their sweet fragrances mixing with the incense that burned constantly in honor of the gods. Pools of crystal clear water reflecting the desert sun, while peacocks strutted across manicured lawns. This was luxury beyond imagination, a paradise on earth reserved for the pharaoh and his chosen women. Now, imagine walking through these opulent halls as Queen Tai, the pharaoh's secondary wife. Your silk sandals whisper against the polished limestone floors as you pass beneath painted ceilings that seem to stretch toward the heavens themselves. Golden braziers cast dancing shadows on walls adorned with precious stones, while servants bow deeply as you glide past, your jewelry catching the light with every step. But despite all this magnificence, despite being married to the most powerful man in the world, Queen Tai burned with a frustration that no amount of gold or precious gems could satisfy. You see, she wasn't the great royal wife, the primary queen who would see her son inherit the throne. That honor belonged to another woman, and it ate at Tia's heart like poison. Every morning, she would wake in her luxurious chambers, surrounded by the finest linens from the Mediterranean, served breakfast on plates of solid gold, attended by a dozen servants whose only purpose was to ensure her comfort. Yet none of this could ease the ache in her chest when she thought about her son, Prince Pentaweret, and his uncertain future. Pentaweret was everything a pharaoh should be. Tall and strong, with the sharp intelligence that marked the royal bloodline. He could recite the sacred texts from memory, command troops with natural authority, and possessed the kind of charisma that made people want to follow him. But birth order and politics meant that another would wear the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt. As Queen Tia sat in her private garden one scorching afternoon, watching her son practice sword work with the palace guards, her mind began to turn toward darker thoughts. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the training ground as Pentaweret moved with the fluid grace of a born warrior. His bronze blade caught the light as he parried and struck, each movement precise and deadly. Sweat glistened on his muscled shoulders as he defeated opponent after opponent, proving again and again that he had the strength to rule. But strength meant nothing without opportunity, and opportunity was something that would have to be created. That evening, as the sun set over the Nile and painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Queen Tai made a decision that would change the course of history. She dismissed her servants early, claiming a headache, and sat alone in her chambers as oil lamps flickered in the gathering darkness. The weight of her choice pressed down on her like the massive stone blocks of the pyramids themselves. She thought about her husband, Ramses III, the man who had conquered foreign armies and built monuments that would last for millennia. He was a great pharaoh, beloved by his people, feared by his enemies, but he was also the obstacle standing between her son and his rightful destiny. The next morning brought with it a visitor that would prove instrumental in the Queen's growing conspiracy. Bedtime was the royal butler, a man who had served in the palace for decades and knew every secret corridor, every whispered conversation, every weakness of every person within those walls. He was a man of average height with intelligent eyes that missed nothing, and he had developed a particular fondness for Queen Tai over the years. When he entered her receiving chamber that morning, carrying a tray of fresh figs and honeyed wine, Tai noticed something different in his demeanor. There was a tension in his shoulders, a carefulness in the way he arranged the fruit on her table. She had known this man for years, had seen him navigate the treacherous waters of palace politics with the skill of a master sailor, and she recognized the signs of a man wrestling with dangerous thoughts. After he had completed his duties and was preparing to leave, Tie spoke his name softly. He turned, and in that moment, their eyes met with an understanding that needed no words. She saw in his gaze the same frustration she felt, the same sense that the natural order of things had been disturbed, the same belief that her son deserved better than the hand fate had dealt him. Over the following weeks, their conversations became longer, more intimate, more treasonous. They spoke in code at first, discussing hypothetical situations and theoretical problems. But gradually, as trust built between them, their words became bolder, their plans more concrete. Bedtime revealed that he wasn't the only one in the palace who felt this way. There were others, men and women who served the royal family, but who had grown disillusioned with the current succession plans. There was Mesjor, another butler whose loyalty had been bought with promises of advancement under a new regime. There were several women of the harem who saw opportunity in chaos, and palace guards who could be convinced that their true allegiance should lie with the strongest, not necessarily the eldest. As the conspiracy grew, so did its complexity. They couldn't simply rush into the pharaoh's chambers with daggers drawn. This was a man protected by the best soldiers in Egypt, surrounded at all times by loyal guards, and blessed by the gods themselves, according to popular belief. Any attempt on his life would have to be subtle, carefully planned, and executed with perfect timing. The conspirators began to meet in secret, usually in the early hours before dawn, when the palace was at its quietest. They would gather in abandoned storage rooms deep within the harem complex, spaces filled with dusty furniture and forgotten treasures from previous reigns. By the light of a single oil lamp, they would plan their pharaoh's downfall. Queen Tia proved to be a masterful orchestrator of this growing rebellion. She understood people in a way that made her both beloved and feared. She knew exactly what to promise each conspirator to secure their loyalty, whether it was gold, position, protection, or revenge against old enemies. She played on their ambitions, their fears, their secret desires, weaving them all into a web of complicity that would be impossible to escape once the deed was done. But perhaps most importantly, she understood her husband. After years of marriage, she knew his routines, his preferences, his moments of vulnerability, guard would be down, when he would be most. She knew when he would be alone, when he's susceptible to attack. The plan that emerged from these clandestine meetings was elegant in its simplicity and terrifying in its implications. They would strike during the festival of Opet, when the palace would be filled with visitors and celebration, when the confusion of crowds and ceremony would provide the perfect cover for their actions. The festival of Ope was Egypt's most magnificent celebration, a time when the god Amun would travel from his temple at Karnak to visit his consort at Luxor. For 11 days, the kingdom would erupt in celebration as priests carried the sacred bark through streets lined with cheering crowds. Musicians would fill the air with hypnotic rhythms, while dancers swayed to ancient melodies that seemed to make the very stones of the temples pulse with divine energy. It was during this chaos of devotion and revelry that Queen Tai planned to change the course of Egyptian history forever. The conspirators had spent months preparing for this moment. Every detail had been rehearsed, every contingency planned for, every possible witness accounted for. They had studied the pharaoh's schedule during previous festivals, noting when he would retire to his private chambers, when his personal guards would be reduced to allow for the sacred ceremonies, when the palace would be at its most vulnerable. But as the festival approached, cracks began to appear in their perfect plan. Hesea, one of the palace scribes who had been recruited to help forge documents that would legitimize Pentawaret's claim to the throne, began having second thoughts. He was a young man, barely 20, who had been swept up in the excitement of conspiracy without fully understanding its implications. As the reality of what they were planning began to sink in, his hands would shake as he practiced the forged hieroglyphs that would need to be perfect if their plot was to succeed. Late one night, just 3 days before the festival was to begin, Hesea approached Pebekamen in one of the palace corridors. The young scribe's face was pale in the flickering torchlight, his eyes darting nervously as he pulled the butler into an empty alcove. "I cannot do this," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the distant sounds of festival preparations. "This is the pharaoh we speak of killing, the living god. The gods will curse us all for this blasphemy." Pebekamen's response was swift and cold. He grabbed the young man by the throat, pressing him against the stone wall with surprising strength for someone his age. "You think the gods care about your doubts?" he hissed. "You think they will protect you when Queen Taye decides you know too much? You are in this now, boy. There is no turning back." The threat was clear, and Hesea nodded shakily, his commitment renewed by fear, if not by conviction. But this incident revealed a dangerous truth that Queen Taye had perhaps not fully considered. As their conspiracy grew larger, it became harder to control, harder to keep secret, and infinitely more dangerous for everyone involved. Meanwhile, Prince Pentawaret remained blissfully unaware of the plot being hatched in his name. He spent his days training with the palace guard, studying with the royal tutors, and participating in the religious ceremonies that would prepare him for the sacred kingship he believed he would never inherit. He was a dutiful son who loved his father, a loyal prince who served his pharaoh without question. If he had known what his mother was planning, would he have stopped her? This question would haunt historians for millennia to come. On the first day of the Opet festival, the palace transformed into something magical. Thousands of visitors poured through the gates, their voices creating a constant buzz of excitement that seemed to make the very air vibrate with anticipation. Merchants set up stalls selling everything from exotic spices to precious amulets, while acrobats and storytellers entertained crowds in every available courtyard. Queen Tiye moved through this celebration like an actress playing the role of her life. She smiled at the visiting dignitaries, embraced the wives of important officials, and played the part of the devoted royal wife to perfection. But beneath her serene exterior, her mind was racing through every detail of what was to come. She had chosen her final team of executioners carefully. There would be 6 men in total, led by Bedtime and including several palace guards who had been turned through a combination of gold and promises. They had been given a special wine, drugged with substances that would dull their fear and sharpen their resolve. They would need both if they were going to kill a pharaoh. The women of the harem had their own roles to play. Several of Ramses's minor wives had been convinced to participate, not necessarily in the killing itself, but in creating the circumstances that would make it possible. They would ensure that certain guards were called away at crucial moments, that specific doors remained unlocked, that the pharaoh's evening meal would be prepared by conspirators rather than his usual trusted servants. As the festival reached its climax on the 7th day, everything seemed to be falling into place perfectly. The pharaoh had participated in the sacred ceremonies with his usual dignity and devotion, accepting the adoration of his people as the crowds chanted his name and threw flower petals at his feet. He seemed relaxed, happy even, basking in the love of his subjects and the favor of the gods. That evening, as the sun set over the Nile and the celebration began to wind down, Ramses III retired to his private chambers for what would be the last time. He dismissed most of his guards, keeping only a skeleton crew, as was his custom during festivals when the palace was secure and filled with loyal visitors. Queen Tia watched from her window as her husband's silhouette disappeared into the royal quarters. Her heart was pounding so loudly she was certain the servants could hear it, but her face remained calm as she gave the signal that would set their plot in motion. The first phase involved getting the remaining guards away from the pharaoh's chambers. This was accomplished through a carefully orchestrated distraction in the eastern wing of the palace, where a fire was set in one of the storage rooms. Not a large fire, nothing that would actually endanger anyone, but enough to require the attention of the palace guard and draw them away from their posts. As the guards rushed to deal with this emergency, Bedtime and his team made their move. They had studied the layout of the royal quarters obsessively, memorizing every corridor, every door, every possible escape route. They moved through the palace like shadows, their drugged wine giving them a false sense of invincibility as they approached their target. The pharaoh's private chambers were a sanctuary of luxury that even the rest of the palace could not match. The walls were covered in gold leaf and precious stones arranged in patterns that told the story of his reign. Ivory furniture inlaid with ebony and silver created a setting fit for a god, while the air was thick with the scent of frankincense and myrrh. Ramses III sat at his writing desk, working on correspondence by the light of several oil lamps. He was wearing a simple linen robe, his crown set aside for the evening, looking more like a tired administrator than the divine ruler of the greatest empire on earth. This was the man who had defeated the Sea Peoples, who had built Abu Simbel, who had expanded Egyptian influence to its greatest extent in generations. He looked up as the door to his chamber opened, expecting to see one of his trusted servants. Instead, he saw Bedtime approaching with 5 other men, their faces grim with deadly purpose. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, the pharaoh and his would-be assassins simply stared at each other. Then Ramses III understood what was happening, and his divine composure cracked for the first time in his adult life. Bedtime, he said quietly, his voice carrying a note of profound sadness rather than fear. How long have you served in this palace? 23 years, my pharaoh, the butler replied, his hand trembling slightly as he gripped the bronze dagger that would end an era. And in all that time, have I not been good to you? Have I not rewarded your service, protected your family, treated you with the respect due a faithful servant? The question hung in the air like incense, heavy with the weight of betrayal and broken loyalty. Bedtime's resolve wavered for a moment, his eyes filling with tears as he remembered all the kindnesses this man had shown him over the years. But then he thought of Queen T, waiting in her chambers for news of their success. He thought of the promises that had been made, the rewards that awaited, the the new world that would be created with Pentawere on the throne. Most of all, he thought of what would happen to him if he failed to complete this task. The dagger flashed in the lamplight as Pebekamen struck. The blade found its mark with shocking swiftness, piercing the pharaoh's chest just below his heart. Ramses III gasped, his eyes widening in disbelief as the warm blood began to flow through his fingers. But this was no ordinary man, and even mortally wounded, the divine pharaoh possessed a strength that caught his attackers off guard. With a roar that seemed to shake the very foundations of the palace, Ramses grabbed Pebekamen by the throat, his powerful hands crushing the butler's windpipe with the fury of a wounded lion. The other conspirators rushed forward, their daggers flashing in the lamplight as they struck again and again. But the pharaoh fought like a man possessed by the gods themselves. Tables overturned, sending precious scrolls and golden ornaments crashing to the floor. The oil lamps flickered wildly as bodies struggled in the dancing shadows, creating a scene that looked like something from the underworld itself. Blood splattered across the walls, decorated with scenes of divine triumph, creating a horrible irony that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. But even a god-king cannot survive when 6 men are determined to see him dead. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, the great Ramses III collapsed to the floor of his own chamber, his blood pooling on the limestone tiles that had been polished to mirror brightness just that morning. Pebekamen lay beside him, his neck broken by the pharaoh's final act of vengeance. The other conspirators stood panting in the sudden silence, their clothes torn and bloodied, staring down at what they had done. The magnitude of their crime began to sink in as they looked upon the lifeless body of the man who had ruled Egypt for over 3 decades. One of the guards, a young man named Pekamen, began to sob uncontrollably. "We have killed the son of Ra," he whispered. "The gods will destroy us all. They will curse our families for 1,000 generations." But there was no time for remorse. Already they could hear voices in the corridors outside. Servants calling for the pharaoh. Guards returning from the manufactured emergency in the eastern wing. The conspirators had perhaps minutes before their crime would be discovered, and their survival depended on executing the rest of their plan with perfect precision. While chaos erupted in the royal chambers, Queen T sat in her private receiving room, ostensibly entertaining several visiting dignitaries' wives with music and wine. She played the perfect hostess, laughing at their stories and complimenting their jewelry, all while her heart hammered against her ribs like a caged bird desperate for freedom. She had positioned herself with a clear view of the corridor that led to the royal quarters, watching for the signal that would tell her whether their plot had succeeded or failed. Every shadow that moved past her doorway made her pulse quicken. Every distant sound could be the footsteps of guards coming to arrest her for treason. Then she saw him. Mez Chur, the second butler, appeared in her doorway with a wine jug in his hands and gave her the slightest nod. It was done. The pharaoh was dead, and her son was one step closer to the throne that was rightfully his. But Queen Tai was too intelligent to believe that killing Ramses was the end of their troubles. It was, in fact, only the beginning. Now they had to convince an entire kingdom that Prince Pentaweret was the legitimate heir, despite the existence of other claimants with stronger legal claims to the throne. The immediate challenge was controlling the narrative of what had happened. The conspirators had prepared a story about foreign assassins, enemy agents who had infiltrated the palace during the festival chaos. They had even planted evidence to support this fiction, including weapons of foreign make and clothing that suggested the killers had come from Nubia or the Levant. Over the next several hours, as the palace erupted in controlled chaos following the discovery of the pharaoh's body, Queen Tai orchestrated perhaps the most audacious cover-up in ancient history. Palace servants who had been bought or blackmailed spread the story of foreign assassins throughout the complex. Guards who were part of the conspiracy provided testimony about suspicious strangers they claimed to have seen near the royal quarters. Meanwhile, Prince Pentaweret was woken from his sleep and informed of his father's death by his mother herself. The young prince's grief was genuine and heartbreaking to witness. He collapsed to his knees in his sleeping chamber, tears streaming down his face as he processed the loss of the man he had loved and admired above all others. How did this happen? He asked through his sobs. How could anyone harm him? He was beloved by the gods, protected by the strongest guards in Egypt. Queen Tiye knelt beside her son, wrapping her arms around his shaking shoulders with what appeared to be maternal comfort. "Foreign agents," she whispered. "Cowards who struck in the darkness because they knew they could never face your father in honest combat. But you must be strong now, my son. Egypt needs a pharaoh, and the gods have chosen you to carry on your father's legacy." What happened next would be debated by scholars for millennia. Did Prince Pentaweret truly believe his mother's story about foreign assassins? Or did some part of him suspect the truth? Did he willingly participate in what followed, or was he manipulated by forces beyond his understanding? The evidence suggests that Pentaweret genuinely believed he was stepping forward to save Egypt from chaos and foreign influence. In his mind, he was honoring his father's memory by accepting the burden of kingship during a time of national crisis. The fact that this crisis had been manufactured by his own mother was a truth too terrible for him to comprehend. Within hours of Ramses's death, Queen Tiye's supporters began spreading word throughout the palace that Prince Pentaweret had received a divine vision instructing him to assume the throne immediately. This vision, they claimed, had come directly from the god Amun-Ra, who was concerned about the vulnerability of Egypt in the wake of the pharaoh's assassination. The story was believable because it followed established religious precedent. Throughout Egyptian history, there had been cases of younger sons or unexpected heirs receiving divine mandates to rule during times of crisis. The priests, many of whom had been carefully cultivated by Queen Tiye over the years, confirmed that such visions were indeed possible and should be taken seriously. But not everyone in the palace was convinced by this convenient revelation. Tay, the great royal wife and mother of the legitimate heir, immediately recognized what was happening and moved to protect her son's claim to the throne. She was a formidable woman in her own right, someone who had navigated the treacherous waters of palace politics for decades and was not easily fooled by elaborate conspiracies. When news of her husband's death reached her, Tay was in the sacred precinct of the palace, participating in the evening prayers that were her daily routine. She received the news with the stoic dignity expected of a queen. But those who knew her well could see the fury burning behind her carefully controlled expression. Tay understood immediately that this was no random assassination by foreign agents. The timing was too convenient, the circumstances too perfectly arranged to benefit Prince Pentaweret. She had watched Queen Tiye's growing frustration over the years, had seen the way the secondary wife looked at her own son with barely concealed ambition. Now that ambition had turned deadly, and Tay found herself in a fight for her family's survival. The great royal wife moved swiftly to secure her son's position. She summoned the loyal palace guards, the ones who had not been corrupted by Queen Tiye's gold and promises. She called together the high priests who had served Ramses faithfully and who understood the proper laws of succession. Most importantly, she sent urgent messages to the military commanders who controlled Egypt's armies, men who had fought alongside Ramses and who would never accept a usurper on the throne. What followed was essentially a cold war within the palace walls, as two factions maneuvered for position in the hours and days following the pharaoh's death. Queen Tiye's supporters controlled key areas of the palace complex, and had the advantage of having prepared for this moment for months. But Tay's faction represented the legitimate government, and had the support of Egypt's established institutions. The tension in the palace became almost unbearable. Servants whispered in corners, afraid to openly declare their loyalty to either side. Guards eyed each other suspiciously, unsure who could be trusted and who might be a conspirator. The very air seemed thick with paranoia and fear as both sides prepared for what many believed would be inevitable bloodshed. Prince Pentaweret found himself at the center of this brewing storm, genuinely believing he was acting in Egypt's best interests while remaining blind to his mother's true role in recent events. He spent long hours in prayer, seeking guidance from the gods about how to unite his divided kingdom. He met with advisors from both factions, trying to find compromises that would prevent civil war. His sincerity was perhaps his greatest tragedy. Here was a young man who genuinely loved Egypt and wanted to serve his people, but who had been manipulated into participating in the greatest crime in the kingdom's history. Every decision he made with noble intentions only drew him deeper into his mother's web of lies and murder. Meanwhile, the kingdom beyond the palace walls remained largely unaware of the power struggle taking place in their midst. The official story of foreign assassins was accepted by most Egyptians, who mourned their beloved pharaoh and looked to their leaders for guidance during this difficult time. Trade continued along the Nile, farmers worked their fields, and priests maintained the daily rituals that kept Egypt in harmony with the gods. But this calm was deceptive. Egypt's enemies were indeed watching, waiting to see whether the kingdom would tear itself apart from within. Nubian chieftains tested Egyptian border defenses, while Libyan tribes gathered their warriors for potential raids. The stability that Ramses had maintained through strength and diplomacy was already beginning to fracture. Queen Tai understood that time was not on her side. Every day that passed without Prince Pentaweret being officially crowned was a day that allowed opposition to her plans to grow stronger. She needed to force a resolution before Tay could gather enough support to expose the truth about Ramses's assassination. The solution she devised was as brilliant as it was ruthless. She would use Egypt's own religious traditions against her enemies, turning the very laws that seemed to work against her son into weapons for his cause. Egyptian succession law was complex, involving not just bloodlines, but also divine approval, priestly endorsement, and popular acceptance. Queen Tyre realized that if she could manipulate just one of these factors decisively enough, the others might fall into line through the momentum of events. She chose to focus on divine approval, the one area where she had the most influence through her carefully cultivated relationships with certain priests and her son's supposed vision from Amun-Ra. If she could stage a dramatic religious ceremony that appeared to confirm Prince Pentaweret's divine right to rule, it might overwhelm opposition through sheer spectacle and apparent heavenly endorsement. The ceremony she planned would take place in the great temple of Karnak, before the most sacred shrine of Amun-Ra himself. There, in front of hundreds of witnesses, Prince Pentaweret would undergo the traditional rituals of divine kingship, including the moment when the god himself would supposedly speak through his priests to confirm the new pharaoh's legitimacy. What the witnesses wouldn't know was that Queen Tai had spent months ensuring that the right priests would be present, that the right words would be spoken, and that any potential disruptions would be quietly prevented. She had turned what should have been a sacred ceremony into an elaborate piece of theatre designed to steal a throne. But even the best-laid plans can be undone by unexpected complications, and Queen Tyre was about to discover that some secrets are too large to be contained forever. On the third day after Ramses's death, as preparations for Prince Pentaweret's coronation ceremony reached their final stages, a palace servant named Khaemwaset made a discovery that would change everything. Khaemwaset was a young man who cleaned the royal quarters, someone so invisible to the palace elite that they spoke freely in his presence, never imagining that he was intelligent enough to understand the implications of what he overheard. But Khaemwaset was far more observant than anyone realized. He had noticed the unusual activity in the days before the pharaoh's death, had seen the secret meetings between Queen Tai and various palace officials, had observed the nervous behavior of guards who were supposedly loyal but who seemed to be avoiding their usual duties. Most importantly, on the night of the assassination, Khaemwaset had been working late in a storage room adjacent to the royal quarters. He had heard the sounds of struggle, the crash of overturning furniture, and most damning of all, He had recognized Pibekaman's voice shouting orders to the other conspirators. For 3 days, the young servant had wrestled with what to do with this terrible knowledge. He understood that accusing the queen of regicide was potentially a death sentence. But he also knew that allowing a murderer to place her son on the throne was a betrayal of everything Egypt stood for. Finally, driven by a sense of duty that overcame his fear, Khemwaset approached one of Tay's loyal guards and requested an audience with the great royal wife. What he revealed to her in a private chamber would provide the evidence needed to expose Queen Tay's conspiracy and bring justice for Ramses's murder. But justice, as Khemwaset was about to learn, was a complicated thing in the world of ancient Egyptian politics, where truth often mattered less than power, and where the price of honesty could be higher than anyone was prepared to pay. Tay listened to Khemwaset's testimony with the iron composure of a woman who had spent decades mastering the art of royal diplomacy. But inside, her blood ran cold as the young servant described in vivid detail the sounds of her husband's murder, the voices he had recognized, the conspiracy that had been brewing under her very nose for months. When Khemwaset finished speaking, Tay sat in silence for several long moments, processing the full scope of what Queen Tay had orchestrated. The audacity of it was breathtaking. To murder the pharaoh in his own chambers, to corrupt loyal servants into assassins, to manipulate her own son into participating in regicide. It was a level of treachery that defied comprehension. "You realize what you're telling me could cost you your life," Tay said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Queen Tiye has already killed the most powerful man in Egypt. What would stop her from silencing one servant who knows too much?" Khemwaset's hands trembled as he knelt before the great royal wife, but his voice remained steady. "My queen, I served Pharaoh Ramses faithfully for 8 years. He was kind to me, treated me with respect when he had no obligation to do so. I cannot let his murderers triumph. I cannot let Egypt fall into the hands of those who would kill their own king for power." The young man's courage moved Tay deeply, but it also presented her with an impossible choice. If she acted on this information immediately, she could prevent Prince Pentaweret's coronation and expose Queen Taye's crimes. But doing so would also throw Egypt into chaos at a moment when the kingdom was already vulnerable to external threats. Civil war seemed inevitable either way. More troubling still was the question of Prince Pentaweret himself. Was he truly innocent of his father's murder, or had he been complicit in the conspiracy from the beginning? They had watched the young prince's grief at the news of his father's death, and it had seemed genuine. But she had also seen him accept the story of divine visions with suspicious readiness. As these thoughts churned through her mind, a commotion erupted in the corridors outside her chamber. Voices shouted orders, sandaled feet ran across stone floors, and the distinctive sound of metal armor clanking announced the arrival of palace guards. For a terrifying moment, Tay wondered if Queen Taye had discovered Khemwaset's betrayal and was moving to silence them both. But when her chamber doors burst open, it was not Queen Taye's conspirators who entered. Instead, General Herihor, commander of Egypt's southern armies, strode into the room with a dozen of his most trusted soldiers behind him. The general's weathered face was grim with purpose as he approached the great royal wife and dropped to one knee in the traditional gesture of respect. "My queen," he said, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had commanded thousands in battle. "I have come as quickly as possible upon receiving word of our pharaoh's death. But the messages I have received from the palace tell conflicting stories. Some speak of foreign assassins, while others whisper of conspiracy within these very walls." They felt a surge of relief at seeing this loyal ally. General Herihor had served alongside Ramses in numerous campaigns, had proven his loyalty in battle after battle, and commanded the respect of Egypt's military elite. If anyone could help her navigate the treacherous waters ahead, it was this grizzled veteran of Egypt's wars. "The truth is more terrible than either story suggests," Tay replied, gesturing for Khemwaset to step forward. This young man witnessed the real circumstances of my husband's murder, and what he has to say will shock you to your very soul. As Cainwaset repeated his testimony to General Herihor, the old soldier's expression grew darker with each detail. When the servant finished speaking, Herihor stood in silence for a long moment, his calloused hands clenched into fists at his sides. "By the gods," he whispered finally, "to think that we have harbored such vipers in our midst. Queen Tyre has not merely committed murder, she has committed sacrilege against the very foundations of Egypt itself. The pharaoh is the living embodiment of the gods on earth. To kill him is to wage war against heaven itself." But even as General Herihor spoke these words of outrage, practical considerations were already forming in his tactical mind. "My queen, we face a dilemma that goes beyond simple justice. Queen Tai has positioned her pieces carefully. She controls key areas of the palace, has corrupted important officials, and has convinced many that Prince Pentaweret's claim is legitimate. If we move against her openly, we risk civil war at the worst possible moment." Tay nodded grimly. "I have been wrestling with the same thoughts. Our enemies beyond Egypt's borders are already testing our defenses. Nubian raiders have been spotted near Aswan, and Libyan tribes are massing near the western oases. They sense weakness and are preparing to exploit it. Then we must be clever," General Herihor said, his tactical instincts taking over. "We cannot simply arrest Queen Tai and her conspirators without proof that will convince the entire kingdom. But neither can we allow a murderer to be crowned as pharaoh. We need evidence that is so overwhelming, so undeniable, that even Queen Tai's supporters will abandon her cause." It was Cainwaset who provided the key to solving this puzzle. "My Lord General," the young servant said hesitantly, "there may be such evidence. In my duties, cleaning the royal quarters, I have access to areas that others cannot reach. After the pharaoh's murder, I noticed that the conspirators failed to clean all traces of their crime. There are bloodstains on stones they thought were hidden, torn fabric caught on furniture edges, and most importantly, a dagger that was dropped in their haste to escape." General Herihor's eyes lit up with interest. "A dagger? Can you describe it?" "It bears the personal seal of Pebekamen," Cainwaset replied. "I recognized it because I had seen him use it many times to cut fruit for the royal meals. It is distinctive, with a handle of carved ivory depicting scenes from his family's history. This was exactly what they needed. Physical evidence that could tie the crime directly to Queen Tai's conspirators. Evidence that would be impossible to explain away or dismiss as forgery. But retrieving it would be dangerous, as Queen Tai's supporters now controlled the area around the royal quarters." "Can you get us to this dagger without being seen?" General Herihor asked. Cainwaset nodded slowly. "The royal quarters will be empty during the evening prayers. Queen T's people will be attending the ceremony she has planned to demonstrate Prince Pentaweret's piety. It would be the perfect time to retrieve the evidence." As they finalized their plans, none of them realized that Queen Tyre was facing her own crisis. The pressure of maintaining her conspiracy while preparing for her son's coronation was beginning to take its toll on even her iron nerves. Several of her co-conspirators were showing signs of cracking under the strain, and she was starting to receive reports of suspicious activity among Tay's supporters. Most troubling of all was a conversation she had overheard between two palace guards who were supposed to be loyal to her cause. They had been discussing their doubts about the foreign assassin's story, wondering aloud why such skilled killers would have left so many traces of their presence. The questions they were asking were exactly the wrong ones, and Queen Taye knew that doubt, once it began to spread, could destroy her carefully constructed narrative. That evening, as the palace prepared for the religious ceremony that would demonstrate Prince Pentaweret's devotion to the gods, Queen Tiye made a decision that would prove to be her undoing. She decided to eliminate the most dangerous potential witnesses to her conspiracy, starting with the guards who had participated in the assassination, but who were now showing signs of weakness. She summoned Paikamen, the young guard who had broken down sobbing after the murder, to her private chambers under the pretext of discussing security arrangements for the ceremony. When he arrived, she was waiting with a cup of wine that had been laced with a slow-acting poison derived from the seeds of the castor plant. "You have served me well," she told him, offering the poisoned cup. "Drink with me to celebrate the dawn of a new era for Egypt." Paikamen accepted the wine gratefully, still unaware that his participation in the conspiracy had marked him for death. As he drank, Queen Tyre watched with cold satisfaction, knowing that within hours he would be dead, taking his dangerous knowledge with him to the grave. But poison, even the subtle varieties favoured by palace conspirators, was not always reliable in its timing. As Paikamen left Queen Tyre's chambers and made his way toward the temple complex, the toxin began to work faster than expected. He stumbled, clutching his stomach as waves of nausea overwhelmed him. Other guards rushed to his aid, assuming he had been stricken by some sudden illness. In his delirium, as the poison attacked his nervous system, Paikamen began to ramble about guilt and divine punishment. "The gods know what we did," he gasped to the guards who were trying to help him. "They know we killed the pharaoh. Queen Tyre said it would be clean, said no one would be hurt except the foreign killers we would blame. But there were no foreign killers. It was us. It was always us." The guards who heard these ravings were stunned into silence. Here was one of their own, clearly dying, confessing to the murder of Ramses III. Some tried to dismiss his words as the delusions of a sick man, but others remembered the inconsistencies they had noticed in the official story, the questions that had never been properly answered. Word of Paikamen's confession spread through the palace like wildfire. Within hours, guards who had been loyal to Queen T were beginning to have serious doubts about their allegiances. The foreign assassin's story, which had seemed plausible in the immediate aftermath of the pharaoh's death, now appeared to be an elaborate lie designed to cover up an even more horrific truth. Meanwhile, General Herihor and his team were making their way through the darkened corridors toward the royal quarters, guided by Kaimwaset's intimate knowledge of the palace layout. They moved like shadows, avoiding the main thoroughfares and using servants' passages that were unknown to most of the palace guard. The royal quarters were indeed empty, just as Kaimwaset had predicted. The ornate chambers that had once housed the most powerful man on earth now stood silent and dark, their golden decorations seeming to mock the tragedy that had occurred within these walls. Bloodstains were still visible on the limestone floors, despite attempts to clean them, and the air still carried the faint scent of violence and death. Kaimwaset led them directly to the spot where he had seen the dropped dagger, behind an overturned table near the pharaoh's writing desk. There, half hidden beneath a silk cushion that had fallen during the struggle, was the weapon that would provide the evidence they needed to expose Queen Tia's conspiracy. General Herihor lifted the dagger carefully, examining the carved ivory handle in the dim light of their oil lamp. The personal seal of Pebekamen was clearly visible, just as Kaimwaset had described. This was proof that could not be explained away or dismissed as coincidence. But as they prepared to leave with their evidence, they heard voices in the corridor outside. Queen Ty's guards were returning earlier than expected from the religious ceremony, and the conspirators found themselves trapped in the very chambers where Ramses had been murdered. "Quick," General Herihor whispered. "Is there another way out of here? Yi." Kaimwaset nodded toward a narrow doorway that led to the pharaoh's private bathing chamber. From there, he knew, a maintenance passage connected to the palace's water system, providing a hidden route that would allow them to escape undetected. As they slipped through the darkness towards safety, carrying the evidence that would bring down Queen Ty's conspiracy, none of them could have imagined the chain of events their discovery would set in motion. The dagger they carried was more than just proof of murder. It was the key that would unlock a scandal so vast that it would shake the very foundations of Egyptian society. Behind them, in the royal quarters they had just vacated, Queen Tia's guards were beginning their evening patrol, unaware that the evidence of their mistress's crimes had just slipped through their fingers. But Queen Tia herself was already sensing that something had gone wrong. Paikamen's public confession had created exactly the kind of attention she had been trying to avoid, and reports were reaching her of increased activity among Tay's supporters. The carefully constructed web of lies and murder that had taken months to create was beginning to unravel, and Queen Tia found herself facing the possibility that her ambitious plot might not only fail, but might also cost her everything she held dear, including the life of the son she had been trying to protect. The next morning brought news that would accelerate the collapse of Queen Tia's conspiracy beyond anything she could have anticipated. General Herihor had spent the night gathering additional evidence and building a coalition of loyal officials who were prepared to stand against the usurper faction. But the most devastating blow came from an unexpected source. Prince Pentaweret himself, still believing in his divine mandate to rule Egypt, had decided to visit the tomb where his father's body was being prepared for burial. He wanted to pray beside Ramses' sarcophagus, to ask for guidance from the man he had loved and admired above all others. What he found there would shatter his world forever. The embalmers, working by torchlight in the sacred chamber, were in the process of examining the pharaoh's body as part of the mummification ritual. As Prince Pentaweret approached his father's remains, he could see clearly for the first time the extent of the injuries that had killed the great pharaoh. These were not the wounds of foreign assassins striking quickly in the darkness. They were the marks of a prolonged struggle, multiple stab wounds from different angles, defensive cuts on the hands and arms where Ramses had tried to protect himself. Most telling of all was the pattern of bruising around the pharaoh's throat, marks that matched the grip of someone the pharaoh had grappled with in his final moments. The chief embalmer, a man named Butahamon, who had served the royal family for decades, looked up as Prince Pentaweret approached. The old priest's eyes were filled with sadness as he gestured toward the pharaoh's wounds. "My prince," he said quietly, "I have prepared the bodies of warriors who died in battle, of kings who fell to enemy arrows, of pharaohs who passed peacefully in their sleep. But these wounds tell a different story. Your father fought for his life against multiple attackers who knew him well enough to get close before work of foreign assassins. The striking. This was not the words hit Prince Pentaweret like physical blows. For the first time since his father's death, he began to question the story he had been told, began to see the inconsistencies that others had already noticed. If foreign killers had been responsible, why had they left so much evidence behind? Why had the palace guards been so conveniently absent from their posts? Why had his own divine vision come at such a perfectly convenient moment? As these doubts swirled through his mind, Prince Pentaweret heard footsteps approaching the tomb entrance. He turned to see his mother, Queen Tia, entering the sacred chamber with several of her supporters behind her. She had come to check on the preparations for Ramses' burial, but her face went pale when she saw her son standing beside the pharaoh's body with such a stricken expression. "My son," she said carefully, "you should not be here alone. The sight of your father's wounds will only increase your grief." But Prince Pentaweret was no longer the naive young man who had accepted his mother's explanations without question. The evidence of his father's true fate lay before him in brutal clarity, and suddenly, many things that had puzzled him began to make terrible sense. "Mother," he said slowly, his voice barely above a whisper, "tell me again about the foreign assassins. Tell me how they managed to get past Father's guards, how they knew exactly where to find him, how they disappeared so completely afterward." Queen Tia felt the foundations of her conspiracy shifting beneath her feet like sand in a desert storm. Her son's questions were the ones she had been dreading, the ones that could unravel everything she had worked to accomplish. "The details are not important," she said, trying to maintain her composure. "What matters is that your father is dead and Egypt needs a strong pharaoh to guide it through these troubled times. The gods have chosen you for this burden, and you must not let doubt weaken your resolve." But Prince Pentaweret was beyond such manipulation now. Looking into his mother's eyes, he saw something that chilled him to the bone. He saw guilt, fear, and the desperate calculation of someone whose lies were finally catching up with them. "You know who killed him," he said, the words coming out like an accusation. "You know because you were involved." The silence that followed this statement seemed to stretch into eternity. Queen Tai's supporters shifted nervously behind her, suddenly aware that they were witnessing a confrontation that could destroy them all. The chief embalmer continued his work, pretending not to hear the conversation that was unfolding beside him. Finally, Queen Tai made her choice. Rather than continue the charade, she decided to trust her son with the truth, believing that his love for her and his desire for the throne would ultimately outweigh his shock at learning about the conspiracy. "Yes," she said quietly, "I know who killed your father. They killed him for you, my son. They killed him so that Egypt could have the pharaoh it truly deserves, rather than the weak successor who would have inherited the throne through accident of birth." Prince Pentaweret staggered backward as if his mother had struck him physically. The full scope of what she was confessing hit him like a collapsing wall, crushing his understanding of everything he had believed about himself, his family, and his destiny. "You had him murdered," he gasped. "You killed my father so I could be pharaoh." "I saved Egypt," Queen Tai replied, her voice growing stronger as she committed fully to her justification. "Your father was a great king, but he was growing old, making decisions that would have weakened the kingdom. You are young, strong, capable of leading Egypt to even greater glory. The gods themselves confirmed this through your vision." "There was no vision!" Prince Pentaweret shouted, his voice echoing off the stone walls of the tomb. "You made it all up. You murdered the pharaoh and then convinced me I was chosen by the gods to replace him." The young prince's anguish was heartbreaking to witness. In the space of a few moments, his entire world had collapsed. The father he had loved was dead by his mother's hand. The divine mandate he had believed in was revealed as an elaborate lie, and the throne he was about to claim was built on a foundation of murder and betrayal. Queen Tai reached out toward her son, desperate to maintain some connection with him, but he backed away from her touch, as if she were a venomous serpent. "Everything I did was for you," she pleaded. "Everything was to secure your rightful place as pharaoh. Can you not see that your father's death, tragic as it was, has opened the path to your destiny?" But Prince Pentaweret was beyond such reasoning now. The moral foundations of his upbringing, the values that Ramses himself had instilled in him, made it impossible for him to accept his mother's justifications. To become pharaoh through murder was not destiny. It was blasphemy against everything Egypt stood for. "I will not be pharaoh," he declared, his voice ringing with newfound resolve. "I will not wear a crown purchased with my father's blood. I will not rule a kingdom built on lies and murder." These words sealed Queen Tai's fate more surely than any evidence General Herihor might produce. Without Prince Pentaweret's willing participation, her entire conspiracy became pointless. She had murdered a pharaoh and corrupted dozens of palace officials for a goal that her own son was now rejecting. But Queen Tai was not prepared to accept defeat so easily. She had come too far, risked too much, to simply abandon her plans now. If Prince Pentaweret would not willingly accept the throne, then perhaps he could be convinced through other means. "You are in shock," she said, her voice taking on a harder edge. "You are not thinking clearly. When you have had time to process what I have told you, you will understand that this was the only way. Egypt needs you as pharaoh, and personal feelings cannot be allowed to interfere with duty to the kingdom." "My duty is to justice," Prince Pentaweret replied firmly. "My duty is to the truth, and the truth is that you are a murderer who has dishonored everything our family stands for." With that declaration, the young prince turned and walked out of the tomb, leaving his mother standing beside the body of the man she had killed. Queen Tiye watched him go with growing desperation, realizing that her son's defection meant the end of everything she had worked for. But she was not finished yet. There were still cards to play, still options to explore. If Prince Pentaweret would not cooperate willingly, then perhaps he could be made to cooperate through force or manipulation. And if that failed, there were other ways to secure power in Egypt, other paths to the throne that did not require her son's consent. As these dark thoughts filled her mind, Queen Tiye began planning the next phase of her conspiracy, unaware that General Harihor was already moving to bring her entire operation crashing down around her. The evidence he had gathered, combined with Prince Pentaweret's rejection of the conspiracy, would soon expose the full scope of Queen Tiye's crimes to the entire palace. But the Queen was not prepared to surrender without a fight, and the battle for Egypt's throne was about to enter its most dangerous phase yet. The web of murder and betrayal that had begun with a single act of assassination was about to expand into something even more destructive, threatening to tear apart the very fabric of Egyptian society and leave the kingdom vulnerable to its enemies at the worst possible moment in its history. The news of Prince Pentaweret's dramatic confrontation with his mother spread through the palace like poison in the bloodstream. Within hours, servants were whispering in dark corners about the young prince who had discovered his father's true killers, about the queen who had orchestrated regicide, about the conspiracy that had rotted the very heart of Egypt's government. General Harihor moved swiftly to capitalize on this development. With Pebekamen's dagger as physical evidence and Prince Pentaweret's testimony as moral confirmation, he finally had what he needed to bring Queen Tiye's conspiracy into the light. But he also understood that timing would be everything in the hours ahead. The general summoned his most trusted officers to a secure meeting room deep within the military quarters of the palace complex. These were men who had fought alongside Ramses in campaigns against the Sea Peoples, who had bled for Egypt on distant battlefields, who understood that their loyalty was to the kingdom itself, rather than to any individual ruler. "Brothers," General Harihor began, his weathered face grave in the flickering lamplight, "what I am about to tell you will test your faith in everything we have served. But I need you to hear the truth, no matter how terrible it may be." He laid Pebekamen's distinctive dagger on the table before them, its ivory handle catching the light like an accusation made manifest. Then, methodically, he presented the evidence that Kaimwaset had provided, the details of Paikamen's deathbed confession, and finally, the account of Prince Pentaweret's rejection of the conspiracy. The officers listened in stunned silence as the full scope of Queen Tiye's treachery became clear. These were hardened warriors who had seen the worst that human nature could offer, but the systematic murder of their beloved pharaoh by his own wife shocked them to their cores. Captain Amenhotep, a scarred veteran who had saved Ramses' life during the Battle of the Delta, was the first to speak. "General, if what you say is true, then we face not just treason, but sacrilege on a scale that defies comprehension. The Queen has not merely killed a man. She has murdered the living embodiment of the gods themselves. And she has done so for the most selfish of reasons," added Captain Katie, whose own father had died defending Ramses during the Libyan campaigns. Not for Egypt's glory, not to protect the kingdom from enemies, but simply to place her own son on a throne he had no right to claim. General Harihor nodded grimly. "The question before us now is how we respond to this crisis. Queen Tiye still controls significant portions of the palace guard, still has supporters among the nobility, still believes she can salvage her conspiracy. If we move against her openly, we risk civil war at the worst possible moment." But Captain Amenhotep's response was swift and uncompromising. "General, with respect, there are some crimes so heinous that they demand immediate justice, regardless of the consequences. To allow a pharaoh's murderer to walk free, even for strategic reasons, would be to abandon everything we have sworn to protect. The other officers murmured their agreement, and General Herihor felt a surge of pride at their unwavering commitment to justice. These men embodied the best of Egyptian military tradition, loyal, honorable, and utterly devoted to their sacred duty. "Then we are agreed," the general said solemnly. "We will arrest Queen Tai and her conspirators at dawn, before they can flee or destroy additional evidence. But we must be prepared for the possibility that this action will split the kingdom apart." As his officers departed to prepare their men for the operation ahead, General Herihor remained behind to contemplate the magnitude of what they were about to undertake. By moving against Queen Tai, they were not merely enforcing justice, they were potentially triggering a succession crisis that could leave Egypt leaderless and vulnerable to external attack. Meanwhile, in her private chambers, Queen Tai was facing the collapse of everything she had worked to achieve. Prince Pentauret's rejection of the conspiracy had shattered her carefully laid plans. But more than that, it had broken her heart. She had genuinely believed that her son would understand her motivations once he learned the truth, that his love for her would overcome his moral objections to her methods. Instead, she found herself alone, abandoned by the very person she had been trying to protect. The other conspirators were growing increasingly nervous, some talking openly about fleeing the palace before their crimes were discovered. The palace guards who had supported her were beginning to waver as word of Paikaman's confession spread throughout the complex. But Queen Tai was not prepared to surrender without one final gambit. If she could not rule Egypt through her son, then perhaps she could find another path to power, another way to salvage something from the wreckage of her conspiracy. She summoned Mesdshur, the butler who had been one of her most reliable allies, to her chambers for what she knew might be their final meeting. The man who entered looked haggard and frightened, his usual composure cracked by the pressure of maintaining their deception. "My queen," he said, barely able to meet her eyes. "The palace is buzzing with rumors about Prince Pentauret's declaration. They say he has renounced his claim to the throne, that he has accused you of organizing the pharaoh's murder. Is it true?" Queen Tia studied this man who had helped her kill a king, seeing in his frightened features the reflection of her own desperation. "It is true that my son has temporarily lost his way," she replied carefully. "But children often rebel against their parents' wisdom. He will come to understand that everything I did was necessary." But Mesdshur was beyond such reassurances now. "My queen, General Herihor's soldiers are asking questions about all of us. They have been interviewing servants, examining the royal quarters, gathering evidence. I fear it is only a matter of time before they come for us all." The queen's response was swift and decisive. "Then we must not wait for them to act. If we cannot rule Egypt openly, then we must find ways to control it from the shadows. There are still loyal supporters throughout the kingdom, governors and administrators who believe in Prince Pentauret's cause. We can rally them to our banner, create an alternative power structure that will challenge whatever government emerges from this crisis." It was a desperate plan, but Queen Tai could see no other option. She had crossed too many lines, committed too many crimes to simply accept defeat and await punishment. If she could not be Egypt's queen, then perhaps she could be the power behind whoever eventually claimed the throne. But even as she outlined this strategy to Mesdshur, both of them could hear sounds of commotion in the corridors outside her chambers. Marching feet, shouted orders, the distinctive clank of military equipment being moved into position. General Herihor's forces were already moving, and time was running out faster than Queen Tai had anticipated. "My queen," Mesdshur whispered urgently. "I think they are coming for us now. What should we do?" Before Queen Tai could respond, the doors to her chamber burst open with a crash that seemed to shake the entire palace. General Herihor strode into the room with a dozen armed soldiers behind him, their bronze spears gleaming in the lamplight like instruments of divine judgment. The general's weathered face was set in lines of grim determination as he approached the woman who had orchestrated the murder of his beloved pharaoh. When he spoke, his voice carried the full weight of military authority and moral outrage. Queen Taye, by order of the legitimate government of Egypt and in the name of justice for Pharaoh Ramses III, you are under arrest for treason, conspiracy, and the murder of the divine king. You will surrender yourself immediately and submit to questioning about your crimes. For a moment, Queen Taye maintained the regal composure that had served her throughout her life at court. She stood straight and proud, every inch the royal wife she had been, refusing to show weakness before her accusers. "General Herihor," she said calmly, "you forget yourself. I am a queen of Egypt, wife to the divine pharaoh, mother to his chosen successor. You have no authority to arrest me or to interfere with the succession that the gods themselves have ordained." But General Herihor was unmoved by her claims of royal privilege. He had seen too much evidence of her guilt, heard too many confessions from her co-conspirators, to be swayed by appeals to her former status. "You are a murderess," he replied bluntly, "and murderers have no claim to divine protection or royal immunity. The gods themselves demand justice for the crime you have committed against their earthly representative." With a gesture, he signaled his soldiers to advance. Queen Taye watched them approach with the calm fatalism of someone who had always known this moment might come. She had gambled everything on her conspiracy's success, and now she would pay the price for its failure. But as the soldiers moved to bind her hands with golden chains, for even arrested queens were accorded certain dignities, Queen Taye made one final attempt to justify her actions. "Everything I did was for Egypt," she declared, her voice ringing with conviction despite her circumstances. "I saw the weaknesses in the succession, the threats to our kingdom's future, the need for strong leadership in dangerous times. History will vindicate my choices, even if you cannot." General Herihor paused for a moment, studying this woman who had orchestrated such an elaborate conspiracy. Despite his anger at her crimes, he could not deny a certain grudging respect for the intelligence and determination she had displayed, even in service of such terrible goals. "Perhaps," he said quietly, "but history will also record that you chose murder over patience, treachery over loyalty, personal ambition over duty to the kingdom you claim to serve. Those are the choices that define a person's legacy, not the justifications they offer afterward." As Queen Taye was led away in chains, Mesdshur and the other conspirators were also arrested, their carefully constructed web of lies and murder finally unraveling completely. The palace that had been the center of Egyptian power for generations was transformed into a crime scene, with investigators examining every room, questioning every servant, and documenting every piece of evidence that could shed light on the conspiracy. But even as justice began to take its course, the broader implications of the crisis were becoming clear. Egypt was now without a legitimate pharaoh, its succession in chaos, its government paralyzed by scandal. The news of Ramses' assassination and Queen Taye's arrest would soon spread beyond the palace walls, creating uncertainty that the kingdom's enemies would be quick to exploit. In the days that followed, as investigators pieced together the full scope of the conspiracy, the true magnitude of Queen Taye's treachery became apparent. She had not merely organized a single assassination, she had systematically corrupted dozens of palace officials, bribed guards, manipulated priests, and created an entire shadow network dedicated to placing her son on the throne. The list of co-conspirators seemed to grow longer with each day of investigation. Palace servants who had seemed loyal for decades were revealed as participants in the plot. Guards who had sworn sacred oaths to protect the pharaoh had instead helped murder him. Even some priests, those most sacred guardians of Egypt's religious traditions, had been compromised by Queen Taye's gold and promises. Prince Pentaweret, meanwhile, had retreated to the temple complex, where he spent his days in prayer and meditation, trying to process the horror of what his mother had done in his name. The young man who had once dreamed of ruling Egypt now wanted nothing more than to escape the palace entirely, to flee to some distant province where he could live in obscurity and try to atone for his unwitting participation in his father's murder. But escape was not an option for someone of royal blood. The investigators needed his testimony to complete their case against Queen Taye, and the kingdom's religious leaders wanted his public renunciation of any claim to the throne to help stabilize the succession crisis. Most painful of all were the visits he received from General Herihor, who was trying to help the young prince understand that his rejection of the conspiracy had been crucial in bringing the criminals to justice. But Prince Pentaweret could not shake the guilt he felt over his initial acceptance of his mother's lies, his willingness to believe in divine visions that had never occurred, his eagerness to claim a throne that was not rightfully his. "I should have known," he told the general during one of these difficult conversations. "I should have questioned the story about foreign assassins. I should have wondered why the gods would choose me over my older brother. My blindness made me complicit in my father's murder." General Herihor tried to reassure him. "Prince, you were manipulated by someone who knew exactly how to exploit your love for Egypt and your respect for divine authority. The guilt belongs to those who deceived you, not to you for being deceived." But such comfort offered little solace to a young man whose world had been shattered by the revelation of his mother's crimes. Prince Pentaweret would spend the rest of his life wrestling with questions about his own role in the conspiracy, wondering whether he could have prevented his father's death, if he had been more suspicious, more questioning, more aware of the darkness that had been growing within the palace walls. As the investigation continued, another disturbing pattern began to emerge. Queen Tia's conspiracy had not been a sudden impulse born of desperation. It had been years in the making, carefully planned and methodically executed with a patience that spoke to her true character. Investigators discovered evidence of secret meetings dating back more than 3 years before Ramses' death. They found records of payments made to various conspirators over extended periods, suggesting that Queen Taye had been building her network of supporters with the systematic thoroughness of a military campaign. Most chilling of all was the discovery of detailed plans for what would have happened after Prince Pentaweret's coronation. Queen Taye had not simply wanted to place her son on the throne. She had intended to eliminate all potential rivals to his rule, including members of the legitimate royal family who might challenge his authority. Lists were found in her private chambers containing the names of nobles, priests, and military officers who were considered potential threats to the new regime. Next to many of these names were notes about how they might be neutralized, some through bribery or blackmail, others through exile or imprisonment, and some through methods that were left ominously unspecified but could be easily imagined. The scope of Queen Tia's ambitions was breathtaking in its ruthlessness. She had not merely planned to murder one pharaoh. She had been preparing to reshape the entire structure of Egyptian government to ensure that her son's rule would never be challenged. It was a conspiracy that would have transformed Egypt from a traditional monarchy into something resembling a dictatorship, with Queen Taye herself as the power behind the throne. General Herihor shared these discoveries with Taye, the legitimate great royal wife, who was now faced with the enormous task of restoring stability to the kingdom. The evidence of Queen Taye's broader plans only reinforced her determination to see justice done, but it also made clear the magnitude of the crisis they faced. She was not simply a murderer, Taye observed as she reviewed the seized documents. She was a revolutionary who sought to overthrow the entire foundation of Egyptian civilization. If her conspiracy had succeeded, it would have destroyed everything our ancestors built over thousands of years. The trial of Queen Taye and her conspirators became the most significant legal proceeding in Egyptian history. Never before had a queen been formally charged with murdering her husband. Never before had the sacred nature of pharaonic authority been so directly challenged. Never before had the stability of the kingdom itself hung in the balance of a criminal case. The proceedings were held in the Great Hall of the palace, with the kingdom's most senior judges presiding over a case that would establish precedents for generations to come. Queen Tiye was brought before the court in chains, but she maintained her regal bearing throughout the proceedings, refusing to show any sign of remorse or regret for her actions. The evidence against her was overwhelming. Witness after witness testified to her role in organizing the conspiracy. Physical evidence linked her associates directly to the murder scene. Most damaging of all was the testimony of Prince Pentaweret himself, who described in heartbreaking detail his mother's confession and her attempts to justify her crimes. But Queen Taya was not prepared to accept defeat, even in the face of such evidence. When given the opportunity to defend herself, she delivered a speech that revealed the full extent of her ambitions and her complete lack of remorse for what she had done. "I stand before you accused of murdering Pharaoh Ramses III, she declared, her voice ringing with defiance. "But I say to you that I did not murder a pharaoh. I removed an obstacle to Egypt's destiny. Ramses was a great king in his time, but his time was passing. He had grown cautious, reluctant to take the bold actions that our kingdom needed to maintain its supremacy over our enemies." The judges listened in stunned silence as Queen Taya outlined her vision for Egypt under Prince Pentaweret's rule. She spoke of expanded military campaigns, of conquered territories, of a golden age that would surpass even the greatest achievements of the past. In her mind, the murder of Ramses had not been a crime, but a necessary sacrifice for the greater good of the kingdom. "My son would have been the greatest pharaoh in Egyptian history," she continued, seemingly oblivious to the horror her words were generating among her audience. "Under his rule, guided by my wisdom and experience, Egypt would have dominated the known world. The gods themselves called for this change, even if mortals were too blind to see it." It was a performance that revealed Queen Taya's complete disconnection from moral reality. She had become so consumed by her ambitions that she could no longer distinguish between her personal desires and divine will, between her family's interests and Egypt's needs, between justified action and inexcusable crime. The judges deliberated for 3 days before returning their verdict. Queen Taya was found guilty on all charges and sentenced to death, a punishment that would normally have been carried out by poison to preserve some dignity for a person of royal blood. But the unprecedented nature of her crimes led the court to impose a harsher sentence. She would be executed by burning, the traditional punishment for those who committed crimes against the gods themselves. It was a sentence that reflected not just the severity of her actions, but the court's determination to send a clear message about the consequences of regicide and treason. The other conspirators faced various punishments, depending on their level of involvement. Some of the guards and servants who had participated in the actual murder were sentenced to death, while others who had played supporting roles received prison sentences or exile. The priests who had been corrupted by Queen Tia's gold were stripped of their positions and banned from serving in any religious capacity. But perhaps the most tragic figure in the entire proceedings was Prince Pentaweret himself. Although he had been cleared of any criminal wrongdoing, the court ruled that his initial acceptance of the conspiracy, however unwitting, had compromised his fitness to rule. He was officially removed from the line of succession and sentenced to exile in a remote oasis, where he would spend the remainder of his life in obscurity and regret. The young prince accepted this sentence with the same dignity he had shown throughout the crisis. He understood that his mother's crimes had made it impossible for him to remain in Egypt, that his very presence would serve as a reminder of the conspiracy that had nearly destroyed the kingdom. On the day of his departure, Prince Pentaweret visited his father's tomb one final time. He knelt beside the sarcophagus where Ramses lay in eternal rest, his body preserved for the afterlife according to ancient custom. The young prince wept as he asked forgiveness from the father he had loved, the man whose murder had been carried out in his name. "I failed you, father," he whispered in the darkness of the tomb. "I allowed myself to be used as a tool for your destruction. I pray that in the afterlife you will find it in your heart to forgive me for my blindness and weakness." The exile of Prince Pentaweret marked the end of one of the darkest chapters in Egyptian history. The conspiracy that had begun with a queen's frustrated ambitions had ultimately consumed everyone it touched, leaving behind a trail of death, betrayal, and shattered lives that would serve as a warning for future generations. But the kingdom itself survived this crisis, as it had survived so many others throughout its long history. The legitimate succession was restored, new pharaohs rose to power, and Egypt continued its role as one of the great civilizations of the ancient world. The story of Queen Taye's conspiracy became a cautionary tale told in palace corridors and temple schools, a reminder of how unchecked ambition could corrupt even those closest to power. It demonstrated that in ancient Egypt, as in all societies, the price of betraying trust and violating sacred bonds was ultimately higher than any reward that might be gained through treachery. The harem system itself was reformed in the wake of the scandal, with new safeguards put in place to prevent such conspiracies from developing in the future. The royal quarters were redesigned to provide better security. The palace guard was reorganized to reduce the possibility of corruption, and new procedures were established for monitoring the activities of royal wives and their supporters. But perhaps the most lasting impact of Queen Taye's conspiracy was the way it changed Egyptian attitudes toward the relationship between power and morality. The crisis had demonstrated that even divine authority could be challenged by human ambition, that even the most sacred institutions could be corrupted by personal greed, that even the closest family bonds could be twisted into instruments of betrayal. The execution of Queen Taye took place on a scorching morning in the desert outside Memphis, witnessed by thousands of Egyptians who had come to see justice done for their murdered pharaoh. She faced her death with the same defiant pride she had shown throughout her trial, refusing to the end to acknowledge the evil of what she had done. As the flames consumed the woman who had nearly destroyed Egyptian civilization, those who watched could not help but reflect on the terrible power of unchecked ambition and the importance of remaining vigilant against the corruption that could grow even in the most sacred places. The scandal of Ramses III's assassination would be remembered for millennia as one of the most shocking betrayals in human history. A reminder that power without moral constraint inevitably leads to destruction, and that the price of such destruction is always paid not just by the guilty, but by entire civilizations that depend on trust, loyalty, and the sacred bonds that hold society together. In the end, Queen Taye's conspiracy had failed not because her plans were flawed or her execution poor, but because she had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of true power. She had believed that authority came from cunning and force, from the ability to manipulate and control others. But the collapse of her conspiracy demonstrated that lasting power comes from legitimacy, from the consent of the governed, and from respect for the moral foundations that make civilization possible. The harem that had once been the center of her ambitious plotting was transformed in the aftermath of the crisis, becoming a more carefully regulated institution with built-in safeguards against future conspiracies. But the memory of what had happened there would linger for generations, a dark reminder of how quickly paradise could become hell when ambition was allowed to override conscience. The story of Queen Taye and her scandalous conspiracy thus became more than just a tale of murder and betrayal. It became a fundamental lesson about the nature of power itself, about the importance of moral constraints on authority, and about the terrible consequences that await those who believe themselves above the laws that govern human society. As Egypt moved forward from this crisis, rebuilding its institutions and restoring its stability, the kingdom carried with it the hard-won knowledge that even the most powerful and privileged individuals are subject to the same moral laws that govern all human beings, and that violations of those laws, no matter how cleverly planned or ruthlessly executed, will ultimately be brought to account. The ripple effects of Queen Taye's execution spread far beyond the borders of Egypt, like waves from a stone thrown into the Nile. Foreign kingdoms that had been watching Egypt's internal crisis with predatory interest suddenly found themselves facing a reinvigorated empire determined to demonstrate that the conspiracy had not weakened its resolve. General Herihor, now serving as regent until a new pharaoh could be properly installed, understood that Egypt's enemies would interpret any sign of continued instability as an invitation to attack. The Nubians to the south had already begun testing Egyptian border defences, while Libyan tribes were massing near the western oases, and sea peoples continued to probe the Mediterranean coastline. But what Egypt's enemies had not anticipated was how the conspiracy's exposure would galvanize the kingdom's loyalty to its traditional institutions. The horror of seeing their divine pharaoh murdered by his own wife had created a surge of patriotic fervor that united Egyptians across all social classes in defense of their civilization. In the great temple of Karnak, High Priest Ramses led daily ceremonies of mourning and renewal, calling upon the gods to protect Egypt during this time of transition. The massive columns of the hypostyle hall echoed with chants and prayers as thousands of worshippers gathered to demonstrate their loyalty to the traditional order that Queen Tyre had tried to destroy. "The gods have tested us," the high priest proclaimed to the assembled crowds, his voice carrying across the vast temple complex, "and we have proven worthy. The conspiracy of darkness has been exposed to the light of justice, and Egypt emerges stronger for having faced this trial." These religious ceremonies served multiple purposes beyond spiritual comfort. They demonstrated to both domestic and foreign audiences that Egypt's institutions remained strong, that the kingdom's faith in its traditional governance was unshaken, and that any potential invaders would face a united and determined population. Meanwhile, in the palace complex, the work of rebuilding Egypt's government continued under General Herihor's watchful eye. The regent had established a council of trusted advisors drawn from the military, the priesthood, and the nobility, creating a temporary governing structure that could maintain stability while the succession crisis was resolved. The question of who would become the next pharaoh was complicated by the fact that Queen Tyre's conspiracy had eliminated several potential candidates. Ramses III's intended heir had died under suspicious circumstances that investigators now suspected might have been early moves in the conspiracy. Other potential successors had been compromised by their associations with Queen Tyre's network of supporters. After weeks of deliberation, the council settled on Ramses IV, a nephew of the murdered pharaoh who had proven his loyalty during the crisis and commanded respect from both the military and the priesthood. The choice was not without controversy, as he was not the closest blood relative to Ramses III, but his moral authority and political skills made him the most viable candidate for restoring stability. The coronation of Ramses IV was designed to be a spectacular demonstration of Egypt's renewed strength and unity. The ceremony took place in Memphis, the ancient capital, with representatives from every province of the kingdom in attendance. Foreign ambassadors were specifically invited to witness the event, sending a clear message that Egypt remained a major power despite its recent internal troubles. As the golden crown of Upper and Lower Egypt was placed upon the new pharaoh's head, the assembled crowds erupted in celebration that could be heard for miles across the desert. But this was more than just a traditional coronation ceremony. It was a statement of defiance against those who had tried to destroy Egypt's sacred institutions, a declaration that the kingdom would emerge from this crisis stronger and more united than before. Ramses IV's first official act as pharaoh was to order the construction of a monument commemorating his predecessor's life and condemning the conspiracy that had ended it. The monument would serve as both a tribute to the murdered king and a warning to future generations about the consequences of betraying sacred trust. But the new pharaoh understood that monuments and ceremonies alone would not be sufficient to restore Egypt's position in the ancient world. He needed to demonstrate, through decisive action, that the kingdom remained capable of projecting power beyond its borders and protecting its interests against any threat. The opportunity came sooner than expected. Nubian raiders, emboldened by reports of chaos in Egypt, launched a major assault on the frontier fortress of Buhan, believing that Egyptian defenses would be weakened by internal divisions. It was exactly the kind of miscalculation that Ramses IV had been hoping his enemies would make. The pharaoh's response was swift and overwhelming. Rather than simply repelling the Nubian attack, he launched a full-scale invasion of Nubian territory, leading his armies personally into battle to demonstrate that Egypt's martial spirit remained unbroken. The campaign was a masterpiece of military strategy and psychological warfare, designed as much to send messages to other potential enemies as to defeat the immediate threat. Egyptian forces swept through Nubian settlements like a desert storm, capturing thousands of prisoners and vast quantities of gold that would help fund the kingdom's recovery from the conspiracy crisis. But more importantly, the speed and decisiveness of the victory demonstrated that reports of Egypt's weakness had been greatly exaggerated. News of the Nubian campaign's success reached Memphis just as investigators were completing their final reports on Queen Ti's conspiracy. The contrast between Egypt's external strength and the internal rot that had nearly destroyed it from within served to highlight the importance of maintaining moral standards, even among the most powerful individuals in society. In the palace archives, scribes worked to preserve every detail of the conspiracy for future generations to study. The complete records of the investigation, including testimonies from witnesses, physical evidence, and detailed accounts of how the plot had been uncovered, were sealed in bronze containers and stored in the most secure vaults of the Royal Library. These records would become one of the most important historical documents in ancient Egyptian civilization, providing insights not just into the specific events of Queen Tia's conspiracy, but into the broader challenges of maintaining political stability in a complex, imperial society. But perhaps the most poignant aftermath of the entire crisis was the fate of the palace servants who had remained loyal despite the corruption that surrounded them. Khaimwaset, the young cleaner whose courage had helped expose the conspiracy, was rewarded with a position in the royal administration and became a symbol of how ordinary individuals could make extraordinary contributions to justice. His story was told throughout Egypt as an example of how moral courage could triumph over fear and self-interest. Schools used his example to teach children about the importance of speaking truth to power, while temples incorporated his tale into their moral instruction for worshippers. Yet even as Egypt celebrated its survival and renewal, the psychological scars of the conspiracy remained visible in unexpected ways. Palace servants jumped at sudden noises, guards checked and rechecked their security procedures, and even the most trusted officials found themselves subject to closer scrutiny than ever before. The harem itself, once a place of luxury and refinement, had become a monument to betrayal and violence. Despite efforts to restore its former elegance, the chambers where Queen Ti had plotted her husband's murder retained an atmosphere of unease that made even the bravest visitors uncomfortable. Ramses IV eventually ordered major sections of the harem to be demolished and rebuilt, hoping that new architecture might help erase the memories of what had happened there. But the servants who worked in the reconstructed areas reported strange dreams and unexplained sounds, as if the very stones remembered the evil that had once flourished within those walls. The new pharaoh also instituted sweeping reforms to prevent similar conspiracies from developing in the future. Royal wives were subject to closer supervision, palace officials underwent regular loyalty investigations, and a new intelligence network was established to monitor potential threats to the royal family. These security measures, while necessary, came at a cost to the informal atmosphere that had previously characterized palace life. The easy familiarity between pharaohs and their servants, the casual interactions that had made the royal household feel like an extended family, gave way to a more formal and suspicious environment where every relationship was viewed through the lens of potential betrayal. General Herihor, who had played such a crucial role in exposing Queen Ti's conspiracy, found himself elevated to unprecedented heights of influence and respect. The new pharaoh appointed him as chief advisor and commander of all Egyptian forces, making him the second most powerful man in the kingdom. But the general took no satisfaction in his elevation, understanding that his prominence was built on the tragic necessity of investigating his beloved pharaoh's murder. In quiet moments, when the demands of governance allowed, he would visit Ramses III's tomb, and reflect on how different things might have been if the conspiracy had never developed. The general's own family had not escaped the crisis unscathed. His eldest son, a young officer in the palace guard, had been questioned extensively about his potential knowledge of the conspiracy, creating a strain in their relationship that took years to heal. The suspicion that fell on anyone with access to the royal quarters had touched even the most loyal servants of the crown. As months passed and Egypt's stability was gradually restored, scholars and priests began the work of interpreting the conspiracy's deeper meaning for Egyptian civilization. How had such corruption been allowed to develop at the very heart of the kingdom? What lessons could be learned to prevent similar tragedies in the future? The high priest Ramses commissioned a series of theological treatises exploring the relationship between divine authority and human ambition. These works, carved into temple walls throughout Egypt, became foundational texts for understanding the moral dimensions of political power in ancient Egyptian thought. One of the most influential of these treatises posed a question that would echo through the centuries. If the gods permit their earthly representative to be murdered, what does this teach us about the nature of divine justice? The answer, developed through careful theological reasoning, was that even divine protection could not shield those who violated the fundamental moral laws that governed human society. This interpretation helped Egyptians process the trauma of their pharaoh's assassination while maintaining their faith in the traditional religious and political order. Queen Tiye's conspiracy was reframed not as evidence of the system's weakness, but as proof of the moral laws that ultimately governed even the most powerful individuals. Meanwhile, in the distant oasis where Prince Pentaweret lived in exile, the former royal heir struggled with his own understanding of these events. Reports of Egypt's recovery and his successors' military victories reached him through traveling merchants, filling him with both pride in his homeland's resilience and renewed guilt over his role in its near destruction. The young man, who had once dreamed of ruling the greatest empire on earth, now spent his days tending date palms and teaching local children to read hieroglyphs. It was a simple life, far removed from the luxury and ceremony of palace existence, but it offered him something he had never found as a prince: peace of mind. His letters to General Herihor, carried by trusted messengers, revealed a man who had found wisdom through suffering. "I have learned," he wrote in one such correspondence, "that true nobility lies not in the accident of birth, but in the choice to serve something greater than oneself. My mother forgot this truth, and it destroyed her. I pray that I will never make the same mistake." These letters became treasured documents in the royal archives, offering insights into the psychological aftermath of the conspiracy from the perspective of one who had been both victim and unwitting participant. Future pharaohs would study Prince Pentaweret's reflections as they grappled with their own challenges of leadership and moral responsibility. The economic impact of Queen Tiye's conspiracy also became apparent as Egypt worked to rebuild its institutions. The bribes and payments she had made to her co-conspirators had drained significant resources from the royal treasury, while the uncertainty created by the succession crisis had disrupted trade relationships throughout the Mediterranean world. Ramses, the Fourth's economic advisors, worked tirelessly to restore Egypt's financial stability, implementing new systems of accountability that made it much more difficult for future conspirators to divert royal resources to criminal purposes. These reforms, born from the necessity of recovery, actually strengthened Egypt's economic position in the long term. The kingdom's merchants and craftsmen, initially shaken by the political upheaval, gradually regained confidence as the new pharaoh's strong leadership became apparent. Trade routes that had been disrupted during the crisis were reopened. Construction projects that had been halted were resumed, and the steady rhythm of economic activity that was the foundation of Egyptian prosperity was restored. Foreign kingdoms that had hoped to exploit Egypt's internal divisions found themselves facing a more formidable opponent than before. The conspiracy's exposure had eliminated many corrupt officials and replaced them with individuals whose loyalty had been tested in the crucible of crisis. The result was a more efficient and effective government than had existed before Queen Tiye's treachery. But perhaps the most lasting legacy of the conspiracy was the way it changed Egyptian attitudes toward the relationship between public service and personal morality. The revelation that trusted palace officials had been willing to murder their king for personal gain shattered many assumptions about the reliability of social bonds and institutional loyalty. In response, Egyptian society developed new emphasis on moral education and character development. Schools that had previously focused primarily on practical skills began incorporating extensive instruction in ethics and civic virtue. Temples expanded their role in providing moral guidance to worshippers. Even the military, traditionally focused on tactical and strategic training, began placing greater emphasis on the moral foundations of loyalty and duty. These cultural changes would influence Egyptian civilization for centuries to come, creating a society that was more conscious of the moral dimensions of political power and more vigilant against the corruption that could undermine even the strongest institutions. The women of Egypt, particularly those in positions of influence, faced increased scrutiny in the aftermath of Queen Tiye's crimes. Many royal wives and noble ladies found themselves under suspicion simply because they belonged to the same class as the conspiracy's leader. This collective punishment was unfair, but it reflected the deep trauma that the betrayal had inflicted on Egyptian society. Some women responded to this suspicion by withdrawing from public life, avoiding any appearance of political ambition that might be misinterpreted as dangerous. Others took the opposite approach, working actively to demonstrate their loyalty and rebuild trust between the royal family and the broader community of palace women. Lady Henutawi, a minor wife of Ramses III, who had refused Queen Tiye's attempts to recruit her into the conspiracy, became a particularly influential figure in this recovery process. Her public testimony about Queen Tiye's recruitment efforts had been crucial evidence in the trial, and her moral courage in refusing to participate despite significant pressure made her a symbol of female virtue and loyalty. Under Lady Henutawi's leadership, the surviving women of the royal household organized themselves into a formal association dedicated to supporting the new pharaoh and demonstrating their commitment to Egypt's traditional values. They established charitable works, sponsored religious ceremonies, and created educational programs that helped restore public confidence in the integrity of palace women. This organization became a model for similar groups throughout Egypt, as women in all social classes sought to distance themselves from Queen Tiye's legacy and demonstrate their own commitment to moral behavior. The conspiracy's aftermath thus generated a broader movement for moral renewal that extended far beyond the palace walls. The priests who had been corrupted by Queen Tiye's gold faced their own process of institutional reform and moral reckoning. The revelation that some religious leaders had been willing to validate false divine visions in exchange for material rewards shook the foundations of Egypt's religious establishment. High Priest Ramses led a comprehensive review of religious practices and personnel, implementing new safeguards against corruption and establishing stricter standards for priestly conduct. Temples that had been compromised by the conspiracy underwent purification rituals, while priests who had maintained their integrity despite temptation were elevated to positions of greater responsibility. These reforms strengthened Egypt's religious institutions and restored public confidence in the moral authority of the priesthood. They also created a more rigorous system of theological education that emphasized the ethical dimensions of religious leadership alongside traditional ritual knowledge. The conspiracy's international implications continued to unfold as foreign kingdoms processed the news of Queen Tiye's crimes and Egypt's response. Some potential enemies, impressed by Egypt's ability to uncover and punish such extensive corruption, concluded that the kingdom was more formidable than they had previously believed. Others, however, saw the conspiracy as evidence of fundamental weaknesses in Egyptian society that could be exploited in future conflicts. These differing interpretations would influence diplomatic and military relationships throughout the ancient Near East for generations to come. The Hittite Empire, Egypt's traditional rival to the north, sent congratulatory messages to Ramses IV while secretly reassessing their strategic position in light of Egypt's demonstrated resilience. Hittite intelligence networks worked to understand how Egyptian investigators had been so successful in uncovering the conspiracy, hoping to learn lessons that might be applied to their own internal security challenges. Similarly, the kingdoms of Mesopotamia studied reports of Queen Tiye's trial with great interest, recognizing that the precedents established in Egyptian courts might influence legal and political developments throughout the civilized world. The concept that even royal family members could be held accountable for crimes against the state was revolutionary in many ancient societies. As the first anniversary of Ramses III's assassination approached, Egypt prepared to commemorate both the tragedy of his murder and the triumph of justice over conspiracy. The ceremonies planned for this observance were designed to honor the murdered pharaoh's memory while celebrating the kingdom's survival and renewal. Ramses IV commissioned a series of artistic works depicting the conspiracy's exposure and Queen Tiye's punishment, ensuring that future generations would understand the importance of maintaining moral standards, even among the most powerful individuals in society. These works, carved into temple walls and painted on palace frescoes, became some of the most powerful political art in ancient Egyptian history. The anniversary observances also included the formal dedication of reforms that had been implemented in response to the conspiracy, new laws governing palace security, updated procedures for royal succession, and enhanced systems of oversight for government officials were all proclaimed as permanent safeguards against future corruption. But perhaps the most moving element of the anniversary commemoration was the public reading of letters from Prince Pentaweret, expressing his continued love for Egypt and his gratitude that justice had been achieved despite the personal cost to his family. These letters, read by General Herihor himself, brought tears to the eyes of many listeners and helped provide closure to one of the most traumatic episodes in Egyptian history. The conspiracy of Queen Tiye had tested Egyptian civilization to its very foundations, challenging assumptions about loyalty, morality, and the nature of political power that had remained unquestioned for centuries. But the kingdom's survival of this test and the reforms that emerged from it ultimately strengthened Egypt's position as one of the ancient world's greatest civilizations. The lessons learned from this crisis would influence Egyptian political thought for millennia to come, creating precedents for accountability and moral leadership that distinguished Egypt from many of its contemporary rivals. The story of Queen Tiye's conspiracy thus became more than just a tale of crime and punishment. It became a fundamental part of Egyptian national identity and a source of enduring wisdom about the relationship between power and responsibility. As Egypt moved forward into a new era of stability and prosperity under Ramses IV's leadership, the kingdom carried with it the hard-won knowledge that even the most sacred institutions must be constantly guarded against corruption, and that the price of freedom from tyranny is eternal vigilance against those who would abuse power for personal gain. The harem that had once been the center of Queen Tiye's ambitious plotting was gradually transformed into something entirely different, a center of learning and cultural refinement where future generations of royal women would be educated in both practical skills and moral philosophy. The chambers where conspiracy had once flourished became classrooms where the importance of virtue and loyalty were taught to those who would one day hold positions of influence in Egyptian society. This transformation was perhaps the most fitting memorial to the victims of Queen Tiye's conspiracy, a demonstration that even the darkest betrayals could ultimately serve the cause of justice and moral progress if their lessons were properly understood and applied. The scandalous reign of Ramses III's harem had ended in tragedy, but from that tragedy emerged a stronger, wiser, and more virtuous Egyptian civilization that would endure for centuries to come. The reverberations of Queen Tiye's downfall extended into every corner of Egyptian society, but nowhere were they felt more acutely than in the sprawling network of regional governors who had built their careers on carefully cultivated relationships with the royal court. These provincial administrators suddenly found themselves navigating treacherous political waters, unsure which loyalties were safe and which connections might prove fatal. In the fertile Delta region, Governor Amenemheb faced a particularly delicate situation. He had maintained cordial relations with Queen Tai for years, exchanging gifts and diplomatic courtesies that were standard practice among Egypt's elite. But now every conversation they had shared, every favor he had granted, every policy he had supported was being scrutinized for signs of complicity in her conspiracy. The governor's wife, Nefertiti, watched her husband pace their private chambers like a caged leopard as reports arrived from Memphis detailing the scope of the investigation. "They are questioning everyone who ever spoke with her," he muttered, running his hands through his greying hair. "Every administrator who attended court functions, every official who participated in royal ceremonies, every provincial leader who sought audience with the royal family." Nefertiti set down her weaving and studied her husband's worried face. She had been married to this man for 23 years, had borne him 4 children, had watched him serve Egypt with dedication and honor throughout their life together. If there was corruption in his heart, she would have sensed it long ago. "You have nothing to fear," she said firmly. "Your loyalty to Egypt has never wavered, and your service to the pharaoh has been exemplary. Let them investigate. The truth will protect those who have lived it honestly." But Amenemheb's fears were not entirely unfounded. In the heightened atmosphere of suspicion that followed Queen Tai's arrest, even innocent associations could be twisted into evidence of guilt. He had approved several construction projects that Queen Tai had personally endorsed, had appointed officials she had recommended, had implemented policies that aligned with her stated preferences for provincial administration. None of these actions had been improper at the time, but in retrospect, they created a pattern that investigators might interpret as evidence of coordination between the governor and the conspiracy. The fact that his province had remained stable and prosperous under his leadership could be seen as proof of competent administration, or it could be viewed as suspicious efficiency that suggested advanced knowledge of political changes. The anxiety that gripped provincial administrators like Amenemheb reflected a broader challenge facing Egyptian society in the aftermath of the conspiracy. How could the kingdom distinguish between those who had been genuinely loyal and those who had simply been fortunate enough to avoid detection? How could legitimate governance continue when every relationship, every decision, every policy choice was viewed through the lens of potential treason? Ramses IV understood that this atmosphere of suspicion, while understandable, could paralyze the very institutions that Egypt needed to function effectively. The kingdom required competent administrators, experienced governors, and skilled officials to maintain the complex systems that kept Egyptian civilization running smoothly. If fear of investigation prevented good people from serving, or if capable leaders were removed based on circumstantial evidence, the conspiracy's damage would extend far beyond Queen Tai's immediate circle. The new pharaoh's solution was both wise and pragmatic. Rather than conducting a wholesale purge of potentially compromised officials, he instituted a systematic review process that allowed administrators to demonstrate their loyalty through their ongoing service. Those who had been genuinely complicit in Queen Tia's schemes would eventually reveal themselves through their actions, while those who had been unwitting pawns would prove their worth through continued dedication to Egypt's welfare. Governor Amenemheb was among the first to benefit from this approach. When investigators arrived in his province to examine his administration, they found meticulous records of every decision he had made, detailed justifications for every policy he had implemented, and comprehensive documentation of every resource he had allocated. More importantly, they discovered that his province had consistently exceeded its tribute obligations to the crown, that his subjects spoke of him with genuine respect and affection, and that his management of local affairs demonstrated exactly the kind of competence and integrity that Egypt needed in its leaders. The investigation concluded that while Governor Amenemheb had indeed maintained cordial relations with Queen Tai, His actions had been motivated by appropriate diplomatic courtesy rather than conspiratorial coordination. His loyalty to Egypt was confirmed, his position was secured, and his example became a model for how other provincial administrators could weather the storm of suspicion that followed the conspiracy's exposure. But not all officials were as fortunate as Amenemheb. In the southern province of Elephantine, Governor Katie faced a much more serious problem. Unlike his Delta counterpart, Katie had developed a genuinely close relationship with Queen T that extended beyond diplomatic necessity into personal friendship and political collaboration. The two had worked together on several ambitious projects, including a massive temple complex dedicated to the goddess Isis and a series of irrigation improvements that had significantly increased agricultural productivity in his region. Queen Tyre had provided funding, political support, and even personal visits to oversee the progress of these initiatives. From Katie's perspective, these projects represented exactly the kind of beneficial cooperation between royal and provincial authorities that made Egyptian civilization function effectively. The temple complex had created jobs for hundreds of workers, enhanced the region's religious prestige, and demonstrated the pharaoh's commitment to honoring the gods throughout his kingdom. The irrigation improvements had increased crop yields, reduced the risk of famine, and generated additional tax revenue that strengthened Egypt's overall economic position. But investigators viewing these same projects through the lens of conspiracy theory saw a different pattern entirely. They noted that the timing of Queen Ty's support coincided with crucial phases of her plot against Ramses III. They observed that the resources she had allocated to Keti's province could have been diverted from other projects that might have strengthened royal security or enhanced the legitimate heir's position. Most damning of all, they discovered correspondence between Katie and Queen Tia that discussed political developments in language that seemed to assume shared knowledge of future changes. One letter in particular attracted the investigators' attention. Written 6 months before Ramses' assassination, it contained Katie's observation that the winds of change are blowing through the kingdom, and wise administrators must position themselves to serve Egypt's future as faithfully as they have served its past. The letter concluded with his expression of gratitude for Queen Tyre's guidance in navigating these changing circumstances. Read in isolation, the letter could be interpreted as evidence that Katie had advanced knowledge of Queen Tyre's conspiracy and was positioning himself to benefit from its success. But Katie himself insisted that his comments had referred to natural generational changes he expected to occur as Ramses aged, and that his gratitude toward Queen Tyre reflected her helpful advice about managing provincial affairs during a period of uncertainty. The ambiguity of such evidence created exactly the kind of interpretive challenges that made the post-conspiracy investigations so difficult. Were Katie's letters evidence of treason, or simply the routine correspondence of a competent administrator seeking guidance from influential court figures? Was his cooperation with Queen Tyre's projects proof of conspiratorial complicity, or merely the appropriate response of a provincial governor to legitimate royal initiatives? General Herihor, who oversaw many of these investigations, found himself wrestling with questions that had no clear answers. The safety of Egypt's institutions required thorough examination of all potential conspirators. But the kingdom's stability also depended on maintaining confidence in the integrity of officials who had served loyally despite their unfortunate associations. The general's approach to cases like Katie's revealed the wisdom that had made him such an effective leader during the crisis. Rather than rushing to judgment based on circumstantial evidence, he implemented a careful process of evaluation that considered both the suspicious elements of an official's record and the broader context of their service to Egypt. In Katie's case, this process revealed a complex picture that defied simple categorization. The governor had indeed maintained a closer relationship with Queen Tyre than was typical for provincial administrators, and some of his correspondence could be interpreted as suggesting advanced knowledge of political changes. but his actual governance of Elephantine province had been exemplary. His loyalty to Egyptian interests had never wavered, and his subjects consistently praised his fairness, competence, and dedication to their welfare. After weeks of careful investigation, General Herihor concluded that Governor Katie represented a category that many officials fell into following the conspiracy's exposure. Individuals who had been manipulated by Queen Tai without fully understanding her ultimate intentions. The Queen had been skilled at cultivating relationships that served her purposes, while leaving her allies unaware of the criminal nature of her broader plans. This conclusion allowed Katie to retain his position, but it came with conditions that reflected the new reality of Egyptian administration. He was required to submit detailed reports of his activities directly to Memphis, rather than through normal bureaucratic channels. His correspondence with royal family members would be monitored. His province would receive regular visits from court inspectors who would verify that his policies served Egypt's interests rather than any personal agenda. These additional oversight measures, while burdensome, actually strengthened the quality of provincial administration throughout Egypt. Governors who had previously operated with considerable autonomy now found themselves more directly connected to royal policy objectives. Regional officials who had once focused primarily on local concerns were encouraged to consider how their decisions affected the kingdom as a whole. The result was a more centralized and coordinated system of government that enhanced Egypt's ability to respond quickly to external threats while maintaining the flexibility that allowed provincial administrators to address local needs effectively. Queen Tai's conspiracy, intended to fragment Egyptian authority through the elimination of legitimate leadership, had inadvertently created circumstances that made the kingdom's government more unified and efficient than ever before. But the personal cost of these institutional improvements was significant for individuals like Governor Katie, who found their previously comfortable relationships with royal authority fundamentally altered. The easy familiarity that had once characterized interactions between provincial and central government gave way to a more formal and cautious atmosphere where every conversation was potentially subject to scrutiny and every decision required careful justification. Katie's wife, Anke Senamun, observed these changes with growing concern for their family's future. "You carry yourself differently now," she told her husband as they walked through their private garden one evening. "There is a tension in your shoulders, a carefulness in your words that was not there before.